All right, I got a guy on the phone who claims he's been killing prostitutes and he's wondering why he's doing it. Ed?
No, this isn't Ed.
Oh.
You haven't killed any prostitutes?
No, I never said my name was Ed. You can call me Clay.
So what happened? How many prostitutes have you killed?
12.
And you're wondering why you do it?
I have a pretty good idea.
Did your mom beat you?
Was your mom a prostitute?
No, I think I just do it for the sense of the power.
Do you have sex with them first?
Yes, and
then what, you strangle them?
once.
How else did you kill them?
Well, a few times, actually most times with a hammer.
And where do you do this primarily?
I've done it twice in a parking garage, and then the rest of the times on the side of the road.
Dude, you gotta have a lot of anger in you.
Yes.
Dude, you're a serial killer.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how old were you when you killed your first woman?
16.
And when you killed your first one, did you go in there knowing you were going to kill her, or it just sort of happened?
I knew I really had it planned out. You know, I wanted to do the whole sending clues.
Right.
Oh, yeah, are you in...
to baffle people, but it turned out no one noticed for a long time.
And then what'd you do with the body? You dumped that somewhere?
Yeah, actually. I think she's probably one of the ones that they found.
Yeah. You're a white guy?
Yeah, Howard, that's pretty funny because the only suspect they had when they started finding the bodies was a black police officer.
Oh.
Turns out one of them was associated with them.
Okay. Now, how far apart are these murders? Like, do you murder and then, like, you feel satisfied for a while?
I don't even understand why I do it, Howard. I don't know if I ever get any satisfaction.
You killed 2 people in the same night?
Yeah, but I went to Mississippi for the second one.
So there's no pattern to how many weeks or days between murders?
No.
You think there's some racial motivation here?
No, Howard. They were just, let's just say a Jimmy Swaggart town. That's pretty much the area around here where the prostitutes all hang out.
I see.
And it's just whoever comes up to you. You don't pick a certain type?
I don't even approach them. I wait for them to approach me, Robin.
When was the last time you killed?
It's been a few months.
Right.
Actually, it's been going on a year.
No, but in all seriousness, I mean, do you think that you can control this? Do you think you can stop?
I think I have been.
Oh, you have been for the last couple of months?
A year he hasn't killed.
Oh, a year?
Yeah.
Almost.
So why do you think you stopped killing all of a sudden?
I really don't know, Howard. Part of it had to do with my car broke down.
So there's no way I'm going to talk you into giving yourself up or anything, right?
No.
I shouldn't even waste my time. I know I'm going to get calls after this and people are going to go, Howard, how come you didn't catch him?
Has anybody ever been close to catching you?
No. No, actually, someone, once when it was in the newspaper, someone joked to me, I know it was you, but, well, they were joking.
Right.
Yeah.
This real call that you just heard was not out of the ordinary for the Howard Stern Show. He often received calls from people with crazy stories that would end up being a hoax. But as this conversation progressed, and the tone went from a light comedic one to a more serious confession, it became clear to Howard, and also the listeners, that they were actually talking to a serial killer. The next day, Howard told his listeners that the FBI had come to the studio asking for a tape of the call. Their suspicion was that this man who had said his name was Clay was connected to what they referred to as the Storyville Slayer. They believed that the man who had talked to Howard was Russell Elwood. He was plagued by drug addiction, and he had no permanent residence. He eventually became a cab driver, and when he couldn't afford housing, he would sleep in his cab. Because of his addiction, he was in and out of jail. It doesn't seem like he was a man who tried to get better. Not having steady income also makes it hard to have any roots planted to settle. But even though he had become no stranger to brushes with the law, it wasn't until 1994 in Hahnville, Louisiana, that Russell attracted real scrutiny. Russell was stopped on the side of the road in an unlit area. When the police caught Russell, he was in the middle of an illegal act, lewd conduct, and indecent exposure. What police found especially troubling was that they had found him in his car in this unlit area, parked on the side of the road, right near where 2 bodies had been found. Russell was told to get out of his car and show his driver's license. The explanation Russell gave for being stopped on the side of the road was that he had to change the oil and repair the brake pads of his car. This was peculiar because it was night. He willingly allowed his vehicle to be searched, and when the police didn't find any of the items that Russell would need, not even a flashlight, if he was indeed fixing his car, they knew that there was no way he could be telling the truth. Police then questioned Russell about the bodies of Cheryl Lewis and Dolores Mack. Those were the names of the 2 bodies closest to where Russell was stopped, but unfortunately, they weren't just worried about these two women. Since the summer of 1991, the police had been searching for the Storyville Slayer. This person that they were searching for had been targeting mainly black girls and women between the ages of 17 and 42. But because none of the crimes were happening in the same places, and the fact that these bodies were often left in water for weeks or even years before being found, it resulted in extreme decomposition and the destruction of incriminating evidence. So, finding the person responsible had been near impossible. Police questioned Russell regarding the murders, but after the initial questioning, he was released because there wasn't enough evidence yet to charge him. I totally get it. Innocent until proven guilty. But his story doesn't add up. So, in 1995, to further investigate these deaths, a task force was assembled by the New Orleans Police Department in conjunction with surrounding parishes and the FBI. By the time of assembly, the task force had two suspects. The first one, a man named Victor Gant, who was a native of New Orleans, specifically Algiers, where a number of the victims had lived. Victor was a police officer, and while on the clock, he spent a lot of his time patrolling red light districts. As years passed, he became acquaintances with a lot of the pimps and prostitutes in the area. He gained a reputation for being corrupt after a number of people reported that he, along with a few others, were running racketeering operations against pimps and other criminals. While Victor was involved in the illegal operations, he met a woman named Sharon Robinson, and she became his roommate. On December 9th, 1994, Sharon went to the police to report that Victor had beat her. In her statement, she said that he punched her in the face and broke her nose. Victor denied this, but stated that he had pushed her during an argument and that she hit her nose on a chair. His statement was then contradicted by Sharon's children, who said that they had witnessed Victor beat their mother, and then their claim was backed up by the emergency room doctor, who testified that the woman's injuries were the result of a beating. A few years prior to Sharon reporting Victor's abuse, a woman had come forward about an attempt on her life. She gave a description of a man that matched Victor's. The woman had gotten into a car with an unknown man in Algiers. The incident had occurred sometime in July of 1991. And according to her testimony, after having a conversation with this man, he strangled her until she was unconscious and then dropped off her body in the street. So to recap, Victor is involved in illegal activities, and he's also a man of interest who has now been accused of abuse. In early 1995, a disciplinary panel and hearing was held to determine Victor's punishment. The key witness in this hearing was supposed to be Sharon Robinson, but on April 30th, 1995, just 4 months after she had reported Victor's abuse, her body was found in a swampy area near the I-55. Sharon's body was discovered next to the remains of a young woman named Karen Ivester. An autopsy determined that Karen had been strangled and Sharon had been beaten and strangled. Investigators believed that Victor had killed both Sharon and her friend Karen in order to get rid of them. Victor was ordered to submit DNA for testing to see whether it matched the saliva that had been found on the chewing tobacco near Karen's body. The results were inconclusive and no charges were filed. Ultimately, he was dismissed from the police force. It seemed very plausible that Victor could be responsible for all of the tragedies. But the task force had no evidence tying him to any of the other killings, and on July 23rd, 1997, they went back to Russell, who had been living with his elderly father in Florida, and questioned him once more. During the 3 days of questioning, Russell gave several statements recorded on tape that seemed to implicate him further. He admitted to frequenting black prostitutes throughout his life. In addition to this, he admitted to frequently taking hard throughout the years. The investigators became increasingly suspicious when Russell started speaking about a dream he had in which he was being questioned about a series of murders by the serial killer task force. He admitted to frequenting the locations where the bodies had been found, but he continued to claim his innocence. Days after the interrogations were complete, Russell was arrested for buying drugs from an undercover police officer at the home he shared with his father. Once Russell was convicted, he was sentenced to 85 days in the county jail. While there, a few instances were reported that would further implicate Russell as being the Storyville Slayer. Multiple witnesses said that Russell was involved in a fight with another inmate. During this fight, he made a comment saying, "Yeah, I killed her, and I'll kill you too. Then an inmate named Stephen Michael Busser came forward and told the police that Russell had boasted to him that he was wanted for more than 60 murders within the state of Louisiana, even going so far as describing one in detail to him. But there was still no concrete evidence to hold him after the initial 85 days. After Russell's release and move to Ohio, one of Russell's cellmates, Stan Hill, contacted the county prosecutor's office and claimed that Russell had described to him in detail how he had driven the women that were his victims to outlying areas of the city, offering them large quantities of drugs that then caused them to overdose. And once unconscious, he would strangle and dump their bodies. I guess at this point it's all hearsay, but there seems to be a lot of things adding up that point to him. Based on this new information, the task force once again tracked Russell down to re-interview him. In the presence of Ron Camden, who was a 27-year-old veteran out of the Cincinnati Police Department's homicide unit, Russell initially denied making any such statements to the inmates, but after an audio tape of Stan Hill's testimony was played, he did admit to saying it. Ron Camden later testified that Russell had made a confession to him that he had killed a black girl and that he had dumped her in the canal. But Ron had no recording of this conversation, and Russell denied ever saying that to him. But then he did end up claiming that he had a mental illness which caused him to boast about everything. He demanded that these interrogations stop and he be allowed to return to New Orleans to see his attorney and to seek treatment for his mental illness. His request was denied. So, as the interrogations continued, Russell confessed again, but he refused to be taped, and quickly after his confession, he began denying that he had ever said any of it. Russell was eventually let go because there was still not enough evidence to detain him longer. In January of the next year, he was stopped for speeding. He was scheduled to appear in court, but failed to appear on time and was arrested for contempt of court. Russell was eventually convicted and ordered to spend 120 days in jail. While there, he was charged with the murders of Cheryl Lewis and Dolores Mack. Russell's trial didn't begin until June 8, 1999. His former cellmates and multiple prostitutes came forward and testified as witnesses. His cellmates said that Russell had made multiple confessions to them about the killings. The prostitutes claimed that Russell had physically assaulted them. Diane Gilliam, who was a former prostitute, told the court that she had dated Russell off and on since the early 90s. She testified that in 1992, while on a date, Russell was under the influence and assaulted her until she was unconscious. When she came to, she said that she was in a pool of her own blood and an area in the woods that she didn't recognize. She said that she did not report the incident because she was a prostitute with a criminal record. Another former prostitute and stripper named Navasa Richmond testified that she had also been physically assaulted twice by Russell. Janie Stokes, who was a former prostitute, testified that after meeting Russell, he took her to lunch and drove her to his house. He suggested drugs, and after they both participated, Russell started to beat her. She managed to flee. But Janie also felt like she could never report the incident because of her involvement in illegal activities and her own addiction issues. 3 witnesses then testified that they had seen Russell with Cheryl Lewis right before she had disappeared. How horrible that so many women were silenced out of fear, and yet Russell was able to keep doing whatever he wanted. Russell's attorneys then asked for a polygraph test to be performed on the then head of the task force, Sue Rushing. This request was granted. During the test, Sue was unable to answer a series of questions regarding Russell's missing documentation, so the result of her questioning was inconclusive. Ultimately, the murder charge for Dolores Mack was dropped. There just wasn't enough evidence against Russell to be charged for that. However, Russell was found guilty of killing Cheryl Lewis, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. As of November 2021, all of the murders, aside from Cheryl Lewis, remain unsolved. So, even though Russell Elwood was convicted and remains a suspect, there was never enough evidence linking him to any other women. Victor left New Orleans after he was discharged from law enforcement and moved to Atlanta, Georgia. Along with Russell, Victor still remains a suspect. And that's the story of the Storyville Slayer. How frustrating to know that there are so many unsolved cases. It is believed that at least 24 lives were taken, but presumably more.
On January 31st, 1939, in Webster, South Dakota, Jerome, or Jerry, Brudos was born. Right from the jump, Jerry's mother, Eileen, made it abundantly clear that she did not want to have another boy. His mom was very verbally and physically abusive towards him. She took most of her resentment and frustrations out on him. The Brudos family moved around quite a bit, and home life was pretty unstable. Jerry didn't want to stay at home with his mother, who hated him, so he would play by himself outside and wander around. One time, Jerry was walking around and stumbled across a junkyard. In this junkyard, he found something fascinating to him, a pair of high heels, open-toed stilettos to be exact. So Jerry took the shoes back home with him. He wore them around the house, in his room, just really feeling the fantasy. Unfortunately, Jerry's mother found him while he was trying them on. She was horrified. She went on a tirade, grabbed the shoes and threw them away. Jerry still wanted the shoes, so he grabbed them from the trash and hid them in his room to play alone. Once again, Eileen found Jerry with the heels, and this time she was enraged. She took the shoes and lit them on fire. When Jerry was in first grade, his family packed up and moved to California. Jerry's new teacher always wore high heels and kept an extra pair in the classroom. This was incredibly tempting to Jerry, who attempted to steal the extra pair of shoes. One of Jerry's classmates saw him going for the heels and called him out. Jerry admitted to his attempted theft, and the teacher got super mad at him. She embarrassed him in front of the entire class, and he left the room. The Brudos' new neighbors had several teenage daughters. Jerry would often sneak over with their little brother and look through their drawers and closets. This is where he developed a new fascination for women's underwear on top of high heels. Jerry went through puberty and started to develop curiosity about his body and bodies that were not like his own. This should not be a shameful time. However, Jerry's mom made it one. She forced him to hand wash his bed sheets when there were stains, almost demonizing him for growing up and having sexual desires. However, Jerry's urges became very scary and would soon turn violent. Jerry began stalking his female neighbors and would look through their windows. He would go through their laundry hanging up on a clothesline and steal their underwear. This happened multiple times, and it got so bad that the police were called to investigate the situation. Jerry caught wind that the cops were trying to find the thief and used this to his advantage. He showed up at the house, imitating a police officer, and asked the girl more questions about the underwear theft. He asked for her to come over to his house so he could ask questions there. She complied and said she would be right over. The girl arrived at Jerry's house and was immediately accosted. A guy wearing a mask held a blade up to the girl's throat, forcing her to take off her clothes and pose for nude pictures. So once he was done, he fled the scene. When Jerry was 17, he asked a girl to go on a drive with him, and she accepted the invite. So Jerry drove this girl to basically the middle of nowhere, close to a farmhouse. He had his blade and threatened the girl that he would hurt her if she didn't remove her clothes. Jerry chased after her, and they got into a little tussle. Well, a couple driving nearby saw all of the commotion, pulled over, and called the police. They searched his vehicle and found women's underwear and scandalous photographs. Jerry was arrested and charged with assault and battery. Jerry was very honest with the thoughts and fantasies he had. For example, he fantasized about capturing a girl, forcing her to do whatever he wanted, and watching her beg to be let go. Many of his fantasies revolved around the hatred of his mother, Eileen, and wanting power over women. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and got released after 9 months because the doctors considered him no longer a danger to society. He didn't know what his next steps were, so he enlisted in the army at age 20. While in the army, Jerry was referred to an army psychiatrist who discharged him because of his weird obsessions. Once he was released, he was forced to move back in with his parents and live in their back shed. The creepy shenanigans started up again, and this time Jerry would become increasingly more violent with his victims. So Jerry was driving around in his car when he spotted a young woman walking home who he decided to follow. When he saw the coast was clear, he jumped behind her and choked her until she passed out. Then he stole her shoes and made a run for it. The woman reported the incident, but she didn't see his face, so there wasn't much the police could do. Jerry got a job as an electronics technician and worked at a radio station. While there, he met a 17-year-old named Darcy Metzler, and the two started dating. After that, they moved around a lot, as it was difficult for Jerry to keep a job, and Darcy became pregnant. She gave birth to a daughter and later on a son. Back at home, things were super weird. Jerry made the basement his dark room to process the creepy photographs he had taken of women and their undergarments. He also wanted Darcy to dress up in the stolen garments and pose naked for photographs. She was not into this, which really upset Jerry. He felt like his wife didn't want to participate in his fantasies, so he needed to fulfill that desire another way. In 1968, his murderous streak would begin. On January 26, 1968, there was a knock at Jerry's front door. Linda Slauson, a 19-year-old girl, was going door to door selling encyclopedias. Linda followed him down into the basement where, unfortunately, Jerry took a piece of wood, knocked her over the head, and strangled her to death once she was down. This was Jerry's first murder victim. Jerry proceeded to dress Linda up in all the different items he had stolen. He put her in various undergarments and high heels and posed her body for pictures. After doing this, he cut off her left foot as a trophy and placed it in a high heel. He then stored it inside a freezer to preserve it. Jerry managed to sneak the body into his car. He drove to the Willamette River, pretended he had a flat tire, and used that as an excuse to pull over and dump the body. Jerry would not lure another victim to their death until November that same year. Within that time frame, Jerry and his family packed up and moved to Salem. On November 26, 1968, Jerry saw 23-year-old Jan Susan Whitney on the side of the road. Her car had broken down between Salem and Albany. Jerry pulled over and offered help, even offering to give her a ride back to his house to call a tow truck. Jan accepted the offer because she had no other option. They arrived at his home, and Jerry proceeded to strangle Jan in the car. Once she was lifeless, he took her body into a secret garage hideout and hung it from a pulley. He dressed her in the stolen underwear and shoes, violated her body, and took photographs. After this, he removed one of her breasts, made a mold of it, and painted it gold. 3 months later, on March 27, 1969, Jerry found his third victim. A 19-year-old college student named Karen Sprinkler was walking to her car parked outside of a department store. Jerry, dressed in drag, approached Karen from behind and threw her into his vehicle. He restrained her and drove back to his garage. Once inside, he forced her into underwear and took photos of her. He repeatedly assaulted her and tragically strangled her with a pulley until she passed away. Multiple attempted kidnappings during this time were unsuccessful. For example, Jerry tried to abduct a 14-year-old girl named Leanne Brumley, but she escaped. In April of 1969, back-to-back kidnappings failed. One, Sharon Wood, a 24-year-old, fled after Jerry approached her with a gun in a parking garage. The next day, Jerry attempted to abduct a 15-year-old girl named Gloria Smith, but thankfully she also got away. April 23, 1969, Jerry pretended to be a police officer outside a shopping mall. He approached Linda Sally, a 22-year-old, and said she needed to come with him to the station. She complied because she believed he was who he said he was, and sadly, Jerry would take Linda's life. He violated her body, strangled her, and even electrocuted her. Then, after he was done playing his disgusting game, he tied a car transmission to her body with a nylon cord and threw her body into the river. In May of 1969, a fisherman discovered Linda's body in the Long Tom River. 2 days later, Karen's body was found just 50 feet away. The police knew they had a serial killer on their hands. Based on the ages of these women, the police started patrolling the nearby college campus. Hundreds of women were questioned by police about a strange man targeting young women. Finally, after tons of interviews, they got a name and description: Jerry Brudos. So the cops start looking through Jerry's file. They saw that Jerry had been arrested on assault charges before. They also found that Jerry was an electrician, which stood out to them. The cord used to tie these women up was all the same kind used by electricians, and one of the bodies had markings attached to electrocution. The police searched Jerry's place and found a myriad of disturbing things. For one, all the photographs of these disturbing crimes, women's shoes and underwear, the wires and tools used to tie his victims. The police were on their way to his house with an arrest warrant, and this guy tried to flee. The authorities caught him and threw him in jail. While there, he tried to convince his wife to burn any evidence, to which she said absolutely not. Once Jerry was arrested, he came clean on every single homicide and attempted homicide. He was deemed not criminally insane and diagnosed with antisocial personality, manifested by fetishism, transvestitism, exhibitionism, voyeurism, and especially sadism. The judge sentenced Jerry to 3 consecutive life sentences in Oregon State Penitentiary, and 1 month after his conviction, Jan Whitney's body was found. Jerry kept tons of women's shoe magazines in his prison cell, as that was his form of sexual entertainment, not regular adult magazines. While he tried to appeal, he was denied and told he would never, ever be released. On March 28, 2006, Jerry died in prison from liver cancer. This one is really intense, but let's get into it. We're gonna talk about a young man who took his fascination with serial killers and true crime stories way too seriously. Someone who went on to commit a truly heinous crime, inspired by some of the all-time worst criminals, such as Ted Bundy and the Yorkshire Ripper. Young James Fairweather was an average student attending Colchester Academy. He was a happy kid and had good attendance in school. In 2012, as James was starting to get older and about to approach his teenage years, a shift began, and it only escalated with the sudden passing of his grandmother, who he loved dearly. His report cards started to look different. His teachers reported that James was turning into a thug and that his personality had changed. His classmates began to see James as someone who dressed weird and acted weird and was an all-around outsider. Those classmates began to bully James. They would call him names like Dumbo. They would make fun of him for having big ears. In turn, James became more aggressive towards everyone. At one point during the school year, a group of his classmates mugged James and pulled out a blade on him. In his junior year, James told people at school that he had plans to decimate some of his fellow classmates. Some students did not return to school the next day after the claim had been made, but it didn't scare all of the students, so a lot of them did come back. He became fascinated with going on the computer and Google searching and studying true crime and homicide. He enjoyed watching videos of sexual assault victims and some really disturbing pornography. He studied, admired, and became obsessed, in particular with Peter Sutcliffe, also known as the Yorkshire Ripper. And of course, Ted Bundy, another one of his favorites. He was infatuated with them. Now, I love true crime cases too, but James Fairweather's love of true crime was not normal. It was very unhealthy. He used these cases and his idols as some sort of a user guide, a how-to guide for revenge and assassination. It started back in 2014 when Fairweather took a blade from the kitchen of his parents' home in Colchester. He slinked out of the house and made his way down to a local neighborhood shop. Using his blade as a weapon, he robbed the shop. He took cigars, cash, and some other random shit. But James got caught for his crime. He was sentenced to 12 months of youth supervision. But right after he received this sentence, on March 29, 2014, Fairweather snuck out of the second-story window of his parents' house and went on prowl looking for someone or something to destroy. He walked around his neighborhood for a bit, but was unsuccessful in finding a victim, so he broadened his search and went walking through Castle Park. That's when he stumbled upon James Atfield, a drunk man who was fast asleep on the walkway of this beautiful park. James was hanging out at his local pub earlier and had 1 or 5 too many. He started his adventure home when he thought it'd be best to take a nap in the park and sleep off some of the buzz. Fairweather had found an easy target, a totally innocent person who couldn't defend themselves because they were asleep. Fairweather took his blade and punctured the man in the abdomen. Atfield woke up from the attack and tried to defend himself the best he could. Fairweather then had to become more aggressive and accomplish his task. James recalls the attack saying he screamed loudly, the sort of scream that goes right through you. James punctured the man in the torso many times. More than 100 puncture wounds were discovered on James Atfield's body. Fairweather also jabbed Atfield through the eye. And I hate to say this, but these cuts were not careless or chaotic or wild, but actually showed that Fairweather had a technique, similar to the technique of the monsters Fairweather admired, such as the Yorkshire Ripper. James has said that during the attack on James Atfield, quote, "My voices were laughing and laughing, louder and louder." Fairweather told police both murder weapons had been thrown in a river. It wasn't until hours later that James Atfield's body was found. It was around 5:45 a.m. that a nearby walker uncovered the horrific scene and called the authorities. Unfortunately, by the time the authorities showed up, James Atfield had passed. The officer who responded to the call recounts the scene. "I saw something lying on the ground. I sprinted towards the object on the floor, which was clearly a body covered in blood. The body was lying face up. At this point, I donned my blue gloves." He said, "I quickly checked on the state of the body, which had a large amount of wounds and a huge amount of blood underneath him. There were lacerations to his head, hands, and face, and a huge amount of blood congealed around his left eye. I couldn't see the eye at all." Fairweather was nowhere in sight. After Fairweather put an end to James Atfield's life, he went back home. He took off his clothes that were drenched in Atfield's body fluid, and he threw the soiled clothes into a trash bag and disposed of the evidence in a trash bin that was designated for dog poop. Fast forward to 3 months later, June 17th, 2014, Fairweather struck again. This time, he didn't wait for nighttime. This time, he pounced on his target in broad daylight. He's getting bolder with his pursuit, cocky even. This time, his victim was 31-year-old Nahid Al-Manea. Nahid was from Saudi Arabia, but moved to the United Kingdom just 6 months prior to study the English language program at the International Academy. Nahid was a great student, very smart and well-liked by her other classmates, as well as by her teachers, the complete opposite of James Fairweather. Not that James knew any of this. Nahid was just a random target. He had no connection to her. The encounter between Nahid Al-Manea and James Fairweather on June 17, 2014, took place at the Salary Brook Trails off of Avon Way. This is the path that Nahid would take to and from her classes on campus. She walked that trail almost every day. She usually would walk this path with her brother, but unfortunately on that day, Nahid was alone. Fairweather was lurking around in the bushes. Nahid was solo, casually walking the trails. Then Fairweather snuck up behind her and hit her. She stumbled to the ground. Fairweather then used a weapon to slash Nahid 16 times. She passed instantly. Once he was done with Nahid, he chucked his weapon into the nearby river, disposing of the evidence. James once again took off his dirty clothes, dripping in red, and put them into the trash. James Atfield and Nahid Al-Manea's bodies were found only 2 miles apart, and the crimes took place just a couple of months apart. But even with this information, the police had nothing to connect these two crimes. At first, they thought they were unrelated crimes. No leads came in, and there were no real people of interest at the time. A £10,000 reward for anyone coming forward with information about the person who committed these crimes was offered, but no one ever came forward with tips or clues. There were multiple composite sketches of who the authorities might be looking for that were released to the public, but none of them actually looked anything like our guy James Fairweather. Fairweather seemed to have gotten away with both of these heinous crimes until May 26, 2015, a whole year later. It was around 11 a.m. that Fairweather was back on Salary Brook trails and in search of another victim. He was back in the bushes, just a few feet away from where Nahid had passed. A woman walking the trail noticed Fairweather and had a gut reaction. She saw him, stopped her route, turned around, and started walking back in the direction she just came from because she was picking up on his vibe. She made a call to the police stating that there was a strange young man stalking around in the bushes and acting suspicious. She also found it odd that he was walking in the dog section of the park, but he didn't have a dog with him. She recounts that day at the park, saying, "He was no more than 15 feet away and staring straight at me. It's a face that will never leave me, a manic look." Back to the story. Police arrived on the scene to find 16-year-old James Fairweather trying to flee, but they stopped him. He said he was just out for a walk to clear his head and that he didn't feel right. The police asked him to take his hands out of his pockets, and he complied, revealing he was wearing rubber gloves and carrying a lock knife. He was then taken into custody. That evening, he confessed to both crimes. He said he had found James Atfield asleep the night the voices in his head were telling him he needed to make the sacrifice and execute James, and that James was the chosen one. The voices said if Fairweather didn't go through with these actions, the voices would come after Fairweather himself. He said the voices were laughing at him louder and louder. He told them that Nahid had brought this act upon herself since she was walking the trails alone. Fairweather was on a roll. He even admitted to police that he was on the hunt for his next victim when they found him over at Salary Brook Trails. And for the cherry on top, he added that if he was jailed and was able to make bail and let out, he would again take the lives of innocent people. However, in January 2016, he retracted his statement. He denied having anything to do with Nahid or James. He denied being in possession of an offensive weapon, but admitted to 2 alternative counts of manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility. The Crown Prosecution Service did not want to take the plea deal. They decided to move forward and pursue the charges. Fairweather was now facing a double homicide trial. The trial took place in April of 2016. Fairweather continued his story of hearing voices in his head telling him to do it and make the sacrifice. He told those evaluating and questioning him that he was possessed by the devil. The courts, however, rejected this notion. It was revealed at the trial that he was diagnosed with Asperger's and autism, and that he had started hearing voices in his head as early as age 11. Dr. Joseph was brought into the trial as a prosecution witness. Dr. Joseph agreed with the Asperger's and autism diagnosis, but he called BS on Fairweather's supposed visual and auditory hallucinations. He said they were totally fabricated. And Dr. Joseph said that James was just making it up in an attempt to deceive the authorities. He was using the hallucinations to distance himself from the reality of what he had done. We know that Fairweather was obsessed and studied all those horrible criminals, and his internet search history can prove that. Talk to any of his teachers. Talk to any of his schoolmates. It was brought to the attention of the court that Fairweather revealed to the doctors evaluating him for this case that he had intentions of executing at least 15 more people, but didn't because he got caught. So this feels like a no-brainer. James Fairweather needs to go to jail. The jury for this case took 8+ hours to reach a final decision, but eventually they found him guilty of both murders. He was sentenced to 27 years in prison without the possibility of parole. And in true James Fairweather fashion, he reacted to the verdict by giving a thumbs up, and then he looked over to his parents and mouthed the words, "I don't give a." Talk about no remorse for your actions. So disrespectful. What do you guys think? Is James Fairweather the worst criminal we've ever covered? Do you believe he was hearing voices in his head leading him to commit these vicious acts? Was it really his grandmother's death that sent him over the edge, or was he just a ticking time bomb? I want to hear all about it, so please let us know in the comments below.
We're talking about the absolutely heart-wrenching case of Evelyn Boswell, a toddler who went missing in Tennessee. The investigation into Evelyn Boswell's disappearance began on February 18, 2020, when her grandfather, Tommy Boswell Sr., reported her missing. telling authorities that he hadn't seen her since Thanksgiving. An official investigation was launched immediately, and on February 19, 2020, authorities issued an Amber Alert in Tennessee for Evelyn, including details that the adorable blue-eyed, blonde-haired baby stood at only 2 feet and weighed only 28 pounds. At first, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released information that Evelyn was last seen December 26, 2019. Now, this date was provided by her mother, Megan Maggie Boswell. But this goes against other dates and details that surfaced in their initial investigation. And here's where the story starts to unravel. After the Amber Alert was issued, Sheriff Jeff Cassidy of Sullivan County, Tennessee, addressed the media, stating that they had received conflicting reports of exactly when Evelyn disappeared. Through their questioning, they determined that Evelyn had most likely not been seen since December 10th or 11th of 2019, and that the last person to see her was apparently Evelyn's babysitter. Authorities felt that this information was probably more reliable because it was coming from a source outside of the family. And they started to realize that Megan's reports just didn't seem to be adding up. Not to mention that apparently every time she spoke to police, her story would change, which feels like a big red flag. The investigation continued with urgency. And on February 21st, 2020, investigators released information that they were looking for a gray BMW and that the person or people inside the gray BMW could have information about where Evelyn might be. But despite receiving over 300 leads, nothing developed. On the same day, Megan Boswell spoke publicly for the first time, stating, "The reason I didn't report it or anything is because I knew the person who had her, and I didn't want them to run away with her. And as soon as they thought anything was going on, they just kind of vanished. So I'm just worried, about where they're at, what they're doing with her at this point in time." But strangely, she still wouldn't say who she thought might have her, only saying that they wouldn't answer her phone calls and pleading that they should bring her back home. She also stated that she would do things differently if she had the chance, like calling authorities on day one. But she ultimately didn't because she was concerned that they would run. Tommy Boswell Sr. also spoke on February 21st, confirming that he called Tennessee's Department of Children's Services after apparently growing concerned that he hadn't seen the child since Thanksgiving. And that's when he dropped another interesting detail. He mentioned that he had apparently spoken to his ex-wife and Megan's mom, Angela, about the missing child. And when he told her that if Evelyn didn't come home, he was going to report her missing, Angela said to him, "You better not. You're going to regret this." That's a pretty wild response to give to the concerned grandfather of a missing child. This was a busy day because Angela and her boyfriend, William McLeod, were arrested in connection with the gray BMW. And they were charged with theft of over $2,500. It would later come to light that the car belonged to Melissa Wood, who was the mother of Megan's boyfriend, Hunter. She was selling the car to Megan, who was buying it for her mother. Well, Megan took the car to get it checked out. But weirdly, Melissa claims, she just took the car and never came back with it. So yeah, it sounds like Megan pretty much stole this car from her boyfriend's mom. Meanwhile, Sullivan County released a reward for Evelyn, with Tommy Boswell Sr. donating $10,000 to the reward pot, and Tommy Boswell Jr. also pitching in $10,000. Even the sheriff himself donated $1,000 to the cause of finding Evelyn Boswell, which shows just how deeply everyone in the community was affected by her disappearance. The search continued on for several days, and Megan Boswell spoke again on February 24th with, you guessed it, a new story. This time, she stated that she knew where Evelyn was and that her mother, Angela, took Evelyn to Mendota, a small town in Virginia. She said, "I told the TBI, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, where to find her in Mendota. My mom took her to a campground in a silver camper, and if they don't go tonight, I'm going to go find her myself because I've told them and they're not really taking it seriously." However, when speaking to investigators, it was discovered that this story didn't add up again. They confirmed that they did check the campground the night before and that their search turned up nothing. Meanwhile, Angela and William appeared in a North Carolina court in connection to the car. William spoke about the car and mentioned it was a gift from Megan, and saying that he had no idea that anything was wrong with the car. Finally, Sullivan County authorities arrested Megan because they were fed up with her continuously changing the story, with Captain Andrew Siebel going so far as to say, "Every time we talk to her, her story changes." I am serious when I say every single time. Clearly frustrated with Megan, they charged her with 1 count of false reporting and held her on $25,000 bond. By this point, over 500 tips had come in, including a tip to search for Evelyn in a North Carolina pond that sat on the property of Mary McLeod, William's grandmother. Mary told authorities that William was devious enough to be involved in something, and noted that when he arrived at her house, his feet were wet. But around 5:30 p.m., authorities deemed that the search was inconclusive, and the search for Evelyn continued on. On February 26th, William finally spoke, saying that he had only seen Evelyn 1 or 2 times since June 2019, when he started dating her grandmother, Angela. He even offered to take a polygraph test and provide DNA samples to help aid in the investigation. Around this same time, Megan also claimed that she was unable to take a polygraph test because she was pregnant. And we won't get into the reliability of polygraph tests here, but what's interesting is that she said she couldn't do this because she was supposedly pregnant. However, officials said that Sullivan County hadn't asked Megan to take a polygraph test because they don't use them. However, Captain Andrew also spoke out about this, saying, "I cannot confirm or deny her pregnancy. What I can tell you is that the jail medical staff keeps track of the pregnant inmates for obvious purposes. On Monday, the 24th of February, there were 4 pregnant inmates. On Tuesday, the 25th of February, there were 4 pregnant inmates. Megan Boswell was booked in there at 9:19 p.m. on Tuesday. The pregnant inmate count went up to 5 on Tuesday, the 25th, at 11 p.m. when a pregnant woman was booked in. On Wednesday, the 26th of February, the pregnant inmate count was 5 total." So it's pretty clear that although he can't actually say it, he didn't believe that she was pregnant at all. The search continued, and after a few quiet days, a terrible discovery was unfortunately made. On March 6th, police found remains in a shed on Tommy Sr.'s property. On March 9th, Megan appeared in court again, and her bond was increased to $150,000, with authorities stating, "We thought it was appropriate under the circumstances to file a motion to increase bond and to have a hearing as soon as possible." Around this time, Angela spoke out saying that she hadn't seen the child since September. She thought Evelyn may have been removed from Megan's custody and placed with a foster family, which is what prompted her to get back in touch with her daughter, Megan, again. Though she mentioned that she didn't want to bring it up to Megan for fear of upsetting her, and she felt her daughter would talk about it when she was ready. Authorities would later confirm that the remains tragically belonged to Evelyn Boswell, and in addition to her body, they found other items that would make sense for a toddler: some clothes, toys, and diapers. At the time, authorities sealed records of her autopsy and how she died in order to maintain the integrity of the investigation. On March 12th, the Boswell family released a statement saying, "The immediate Boswell family, excluding Angela Jones Boswell, of Evelyn are in anguish and grief over their loss. It has been a very rough and trying time for everyone. At this time, they do not want to speak publicly in regards to the tragedy. They are still trying to process what has happened. They ask for the media and the public to respect their wishes." So much of Evelyn's story still remains a mystery, and it wasn't until a recent hearing in September 2022, which was set to determine if Evelyn's autopsy photographs should be shown to a jury, that we learned more of the truly gruesome details about what investigators actually found that day. Brian Fraley from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation spoke during the hearing, stating that when they responded to a phone call from Tommy Sr., they turned their search to investigate a shed on his property. Inside the shed, they found a playhouse and behind the playhouse, they found Evelyn's remains placed in a trash bag with other trash bags surrounding it. The coroner said that Evelyn was alive when she was placed headfirst into the trash can, which is just absolutely awful, and that apparently it was the fact that she was placed headfirst, wrapped in a blanket, that suffocated her, along with a small piece of aluminum foil that they found in her throat that was blocking her airway. That poor, poor baby. At some point, Megan changed her story again and claimed that Evelyn had suffocated while she co-slept in bed with her and her boyfriend Hunter. But experts claimed that at the time of her death, Evelyn was too old to die in that way. So this seems just like another one of Megan's lies, and Evelyn's death was ultimately ruled a homicide. Unfortunately, there isn't much of a conclusion to this story yet. As Megan's trial is set for February of 2023 at the earliest, she faces a slew of charges, including 1 count of felony murder in the perpetration of child abuse, 1 count of felony murder and perpetration of child neglect, 1 count of aggravated child abuse, 1 count of aggravated child neglect, 1 count of tampering with evidence, 1 count of abuse of a corpse, 1 count of failure to report a deal under suspicious, unusual, or unnatural circumstances, and 12 counts of false reports. So, hopefully, one day, justice will be served for sweet Evelyn. But if there's anything positive to come out of this case, it's the passage of Tennessee's Evelyn's Law, which mandates that it's illegal not to report a child 12 or younger missing within a reasonable time, and no more than 24 hours after their disappearance, hopefully helping to prevent future cases like this from happening. Well, folks, that's all for today. What do you think happened to Evelyn? Is Megan guilty? Was it Angela? Do you have any new information on this case? I'm Lindsay, and we'll see you next time on Killer Bites.